Welcome back to the hearth, friends. Settle in. The wind's howling outside, but we've got a story to keep us warm. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the Oakhaven County Fair, but the real heat came from the glaring eyes of the townsfolk. Elara stood frozen behind her small, splintered wooden table, her knuckles stretched stark white, gripping the edge of a dented tin pie pan like it was the only solid thing left in her shattered world. Women in pristine silk and lace walked past, deliberately lifting their skirts to avoid brushing her hem. They threw whispers sharp as broken glass. Forsaken, penniless widow, she does to belong here. Elara's breathing grew shallow. A single treacherous tear spilled over her pale lashes, tracking through a faint dusting of flour on her sunken cheek. She had poured her very soul, her last cup of sugar, and the last remnants of her courage, into this one humble offering. Across the bustling fairground, the crowd suddenly parted, not out of respect, but out of sheer, undeniable intimidation. Callahan stepped into the sunlight. He was a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders blocking out the sun, his weathered Stetson casting a deep shadow over eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He watched the delicate, trembling woman shrink beneath the town's cruelty, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. The town had discarded her. They had deemed her worthless. Callahan's massive, calloused hands curled into fists at his sides. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. Before we step back into the dust of Oakhaven, if you're finding comfort by our fire, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know you want to hear the rest of this tale, and it keeps the embers burning for more stories just like this one. Now, let me paint the picture of what true desperation looks like on the frontier. It does always look like a man with a drawn iron, or a wagon with a broken wheel in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes, desperation wears a meticulously mended powder blue calico dress. Sometimes, it looks like a 24-year-old woman named Elara, standing on trembling legs at the edge of the Oakhaven County Fair. To understand the sheer terror gripping her heart in that moment, you have to understand the bitter, freezing week that led her to this dusty patch of earth. Her cabin, if you could even call it that, sat 5 miles outside of town on a barren ridge. It was no more than a wooden shell, rattling and groaning against the unforgiving Wyoming wind. Since her husband's sudden, tragic passing 6 months prior, the town hadn't offered a single hand of grace. Instead, the local bank, owned by the very men currently parading around the fairgrounds in their fine suits, had laid claim to every single thing her husband had left behind. They took the plow. They took the mule. They took the winter stores. They blamed Elara for his outstanding debts, casting her out of respectable society and treating her as if her mere presence was a blight on their prospering town. Elara had woken before the sun that morning, her breath pluming in the freezing dark of her drafty kitchen. The flour bin was entirely empty. She had scraped the very last crystalline drops of wild honey from a cracked clay jar. She had walked 2 miles the day before, just to find a few wild, tart heirloom apples growing near a dried-up creek bed. Every single ingredient was a testament to her sheer will to survive. But the most important piece of it all was the vessel itself. She didn't have a gleaming ceramic dish or a heavy iron skillet. She had a dented, blackened tin pie pan. It had survived the brutal wagon trail out west. It had survived her mother's passing. It was the only object in the entire world that Elara still possessed that held the warmth of a loving memory. She clung to that pan like a shield. The county fair baking competition offered a prize of $5. To the wealthy elite of Oakhaven, $5 was pocket change, the price of a new velvet ribbon or a fine imported cigar. To Elara, $5 meant buying enough flour and oats to survive the impending winter. It meant keeping the bank from throwing her out into the deep snow. It was her absolute last hope. She had walked those 5 dusty miles into town, clutching the warm pie wrapped in a thin towel, feeling every jiggle rock through the worn, paper-thin soles of her leather boots. When she arrived, the fair organizers hadn't allowed her to set up her little wooden table under the massive, shaded canvas tents where the respectable women gathered. They banished her to the far edge of the fairgrounds, right next to the livestock pens. The heavy, suffocating stench of manure and dry dust hung thick in the air. The autumn sun beat down on her with punishing heat, offering no mercy to her fragile frame. She looked completely out of place. Her petite, exceptionally slender figure made her look like a porcelain doll left out in a harsh winter storm. Her pale skin was flushed from the brutal walk, and her heavy, worn gray knit shawl offered little protection from the elements, but she wore it tightly wrapped around her shoulders anyway, trying to make herself as small as possible. She kept her deep, dark eyes cast downward, staring at the splinters in her table, absorbing the cruel, passing remarks of the townsfolk like physical blows. Mrs. Gable, the bankeress' wife, strolled past with a parasol resting on her shoulder. Her heavy velvet dress rustled arrogantly against the dry prairie grass. She paused, pretending to inspect a jar of preserves on a neighboring table, but her voice carried loud and clear over the ambient noise of the crowd. "Look at her, flaunting herself in public when she owes my husband a fortune. You'd think the forsaken little mouse would have the decency to leave town. Did she steal those apples? That blackened tin pan is fit for a stray dog, not a county fair." Elara's chest tightened so fiercely she felt as though she might suffocate. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. Her delicate fingers trembled violently as she gripped the edge of the dented tin pan. She wanted to run. Every instinct in her shattered heart screamed at her to turn around, to flee back to the lonely, freezing isolation of her cabin, where no one could look at her with such naked disgust. But she couldn't. The phantom chill of winter pushed her forward. She stood her ground. Her resilience was quiet, almost invisible, but it was diamond hard. She swallowed the lump of utter humiliation, burning in her throat, and remained absolutely still. Across the bustling fairgrounds, far away from the petty gossip and the suffocating scent of cheap floral perfume, a different kind of presence had arrived. Callahan sat atop his massive draft, cross-horse at the edge of the main thoroughfare. He didn't ride a standard Mustang. A regular horse would have snapped under his immense weight. At over 6.5 feet tall, with a chest like a whiskey barrel and shoulders that seemed to block out the very sun, Callahan was an undisputed giant of the territory. He lived up on the high timber ridges, running a successful cattle operation miles away from the hypocritical venom of Oakhaven. He was a man of few words. The townspeople whispered wild rumors about him. They said he wrestled bears for sport. They said he could fell a pine tree with a single swing. When he came down from the mountain for supplies, the town's bravest men suddenly found reasons to look the other way, crossing the street to avoid his path. Callahan preferred it that way. He hated the town. He hated the fake smiles, the corrupt bankers, the respectable women who wore religion like a Sunday hat, but possessed hearts as black as coal. He sat on his horse, the dust settling around his heavy canvas duster coat, his wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low over piercing, watchful hazel eyes. He observed the fair with utter detachment. It was a circus of fools. He was just about to turn his horse around and head to the general store when a flash of powder blue caught his eye. His gaze locked onto the far edge of the fairgrounds. He saw the livestock pens, and then he saw her. Even from 100 yards away, Callahan could see the extreme contrast between the delicate woman and the harsh environment trying to crush her. He watched the way the wealthy women paraded past her table, leaving a wake of cruel whispers. He saw the way she physically recoiled, her tiny, fragile shoulders dropping, her hands gripping the table as if trying to anchor herself to the earth. Callahan's thick, rugged jawline clenched, his massive, calloused tongue tightened on the leather reins. He recognized that look. It was the look of a trapped, wounded animal surrounded by vicious hounds. But as he watched, he noticed something else. She didn't break. She trembled. She looked absolutely terrified. But she did not break. She stood her ground. A profound, unfamiliar sensation shifted deep within Callahan's broad chest. It wasn't. Pity was cheap. It was profound, sudden respect, and it was followed immediately by a fierce, undeniable instinct that roared to life in his blood. He swung his massive frame down from the saddle. His heavy leather riding boots hit the hard-packed dirt with a resounding thud. His silver spurs jingled with a sharp, dangerous metallic ring. He tied his horse to a post and began to walk. Callahan moved through the crowded fairgrounds like an unstoppable force of nature. He didn't rush. He didn't shove anyone. He didn't have to. The sheer intimidating scale of the man, the dark, dangerous aura radiating from his stoic expression, caused the crowd to instinctively part. Men in fine suits took hasty steps backward, tipping their hats nervously. Women lowered their parasols and silenced their gossip. Callahan ignored them all. His piercing gaze remained entirely fixed on the delicate figure in the powder blue dress standing at the edge of the dust. Over by the tables, the judging had officially begun. Mayor Higgins, a rotund, sweaty man who owed his entire political career to the bank, led the procession of judges. They moved down the line of tables, under the shade of the canvas tents, loudly praising the extravagant, expensive cakes baked by the wives of the town's elite. They tasted Mrs. Gable's towering rum cake, declaring it a triumph of culinary excellence, despite the fact that everyone knew she had ordered the ingredients from a catalog back east. The procession finally moved out from the shade and into the punishing sun, arriving at the end of the line. They stopped in front of Elara. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over that section of the fair. The mocking whispers stopped, replaced by a cruel, eager anticipation. The town wanted to see her publicly humiliated. They wanted to see the final nail driven into the coffin of her dignity. Elara forced her trembling hands to her sides. She stood as tall as her petite frame would allow, looking at the mayor with deep, sorrowful dark eyes. Mayor Higgins stopped in front of her splintered table. He didn't look at her face. He looked down at the dented, blackened tin pan, holding the single modest spiced honey apple pie. He let out a loud, theatrical snort of disgust. What in the good Lord's name is this supposed to be? Elara's voice barely rose above the rustling wind. It was soft, fragile, yet laced with quiet dignity. Spiced kepi de apple and honey. The mayor shook his head slowly, putting on a show for the gathering crowd of wealthy onlookers. A dented piece of scrap metal. You bring a dented piece of scrap metal to the Oakhaven County Fair. We have standards here, widow. We don't serve livestock feed to our judges. A cruel ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Elara felt a single, agonizing tear break free, sliding down her pale cheek. Her chest burned. The humiliation was absolute. She had failed. The winter would come. The bank would take the cabin. And she would disappear into the snow, completely forgotten. Taste it, Higgins. The rules say you must taste every entry. Mrs. Gable's voice rang out from the back of the crowd, practically dripping. Vekep ite hot. Venomous amusement. Let's get this over with so we can announce the real winner. The mayor sighed heavily, drawing a silver fork from his coat pocket. He jabbed it aggressively into the center of Elara's pie, breaking the perfectly golden, flaky crust. He lifted a small portion to his mouth, rolling his eyes in exaggerated suffering. He placed it on his tongue. The crowd waited for the final, crushing insult. They waited for him to spit it into the dirt, but the mayor froze. For a single fleeting second, the mayor's eyes widened in sheer, uncontrollable shock. The flaky crust dissolved on his tongue, giving way to the perfect, rich, complex warmth of tart wild apples, deep cinnamon, and the pure, clean sweetness of wild honey. It was entirely flawless. It possessed a depth of flavor that Mrs. Gable's expensive, store-bought ingredients could never even begin to achieve. It was the single best thing he had ever tasted in his miserable life. Elara watched his face closely. She saw the shock. She saw the undeniable truth flash in his eyes. A tiny, desperate spark of hope ignited in her chest. Had she done it? Had she actually saved herself? But the mayor was a corrupt man. He slowly lowered the silver fork. He looked over the crowd, catching the eye of Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. He saw the cold, demanding expectation on her face. If he declared the destitute widow the winner over the banker's wife, his political funding would vanish overnight. The social order of Oakhaven demanded that the weak be crushed to elevate the strong. The mayor's face hardened into a mask of pure, ugly cruelty. The spark of hope in Elara's chest was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. She knew what was coming. She knew the lie was forming on his lips. This is absolutely repulsive. The mayor raised his voice, ensuring the entire fairground could hear his booming, arrogant decree. He lifted the silver fork, pointing it threateningly at Elara's fragile face. It tastes like dirt and desperation. You have wasted our time, widow. This town is done tolerating your presence. He reached out, his thick, sweaty hand moving to grab the edge of the dented tin pan, fully intending to hurl Elara's only hope, her mother's cherished heirloom, straight into the manure-stained dirt. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, physically bracing for the sound of the tin shattering against the ground. but the sound never came. Instead, a sudden, terrifying shadow plunged the entire table into darkness, entirely blocking out the harsh autumn sun. The temperature in the air seemed to plummet 10 degrees in a single second. The cruel laughter of the crowd died in their throats, cut off as violently as a severed rope. Elara slowly opened her eyes. A massive, scarred hand, entirely encased in a battered leather riding glove, had clamped down over the mayoress' wrist with the crushing, immovable force of an iron vice. Callahan stood right beside Elara's frail shoulder, towering over the mayor like a vengeful mountain. Listen to me closely, friends, because there is a very specific, terrifying silence that over a corrupt frontier town when a true apex predator steps out from the shadows and directly into the sunlight. It is a peaceful quiet. It is the heavy, suffocating, breathless void that precedes a devastating prairie tornado. Every single eye in the Oakhaven Fairgrounds locked onto the terrifying tableau unfolding at the absolute edge of the dust. The mayor, a cowardly man who had spent his entire pathetic life bullying those weaker than him from the utter safety of his oak-paneled bank office, suddenly found himself entirely at the mercy of a living, breathing mountain. Callahan did not draw his heavy iron. He didn't raise his voice into a shout. He simply held the mayoress' thick, sweaty wrist in a grip that promised instant, permanent destruction if the man dared to move even one fraction of an inch closer to Elara's splintered table. The sheer, undeniable size difference was almost comical, yet intensely, profoundly terrifying. Callahan's massive shoulders entirely eclipsed the afternoon sun, casting a long, impenetrable dark shadow that enveloped Elara completely. In a single second, he became an absolute shield, instantly blocking her from the harsh glare of both the autumn heat and the town's vicious, crushing judgment. The mayor choked violently on his own panicked breath. His greasy face drained of all natural color, turning a sickly, pale shade of gray. He stared straight up at the towering giant cowboy, his small eyes bulging with naked, unfiltered terror. He instinctively tried to yank his arm back to escape the crushing pressure, but Callahan's leather-clad hand remained absolutely immovable. It was anchored in the empty air like a massive, ancient oak tree rooted deep beneath the Wyoming bedrock. Drop the hand. Callahan's voice was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate straight up from the dry, cracked earth. It wasn't a shout. It was a dark, dangerous, undeniable promise. The threat of extreme retribution hung thick and heavy in the dusty air, yet Callahan remained entirely motionless, an absolute master of total, unyielding stoic control. The mayor swallowed hard, a pathetic, high-pitched squeaking noise escaping his tight throat. His thick fingers uncurled instantly. He stumbled backward the absolute second Callahan released his trapped wrist, desperately scrambling away and nearly tripping over the heavy, muddy hem of Mrs. Gable's extravagant velvet dress. The crowd gasped collectively, shrinking back in unified fear, their expensive boots shuffling through the dirt to create a wide, respectful circle around the tiny, splintered wooden table. Elara stood entirely frozen, her chest hitched with rapid, shallow, terrified breaths. She stared up at the towering, impossible man standing directly beside her. She had seen him before, a distant, terrifying mythic figure riding the high, lonely timber ridge lines. But up close, his immense physical scale was utterly overwhelming. He possessed a chest like a whiskey barrel, and arms thick with heavy corded muscle, built from years of breaking wild horses and felling ancient pines. Yet, as she forced her trembling gaze up into his weathered face, she didn't find the cold, predatory glare she fully expected to see. Beneath the deep shadow of his faded brown Stetson, his piercing hazel eyes held a steady, quiet, profound calm. He didn't look at her with cheap pity. Pity was an insult she could no longer bear. Instead, he looked at her with an intense, unwavering, absolute respect that sent a massive jolt straight through her fragile, battered heart. He slowly turned his massive frame entirely away from the trembling, pathetic mayor, directing his complete, undivided attention to the small, dented tin pan resting quietly on the table. The visual contrast was startling, almost breathtaking in its extreme differences. Here was a man whose massive hands were built for wrestling heavy, struggling steers to the frozen ground, hands covered in thick, rough calluses and faded silver scars from years of brutal, unforgiving frontier labor. But as he reached slowly down toward her table, he moved with agonizing, deliberate slowness, intentionally telegraphing his movements so as not to frighten her already shattered nerves. He gently pulled his battered leather riding glove off his right hand, tucking it securely into his heavy leather belt. His massive, bare fingers hovered over the cracked silver fork the mayor had arrogantly discarded on the rough wood. He picked it up. The fine silver utensil looked like a tiny, fragile child's toy, trapped in his immense, powerful grip. Callahan looked straight down at the ruined center of the spiced honey apple pie. He saw the perfectly golden, incredibly flaky crust that had been baked with absolute precision. He smelled the deep, warm, inviting aroma of wild cinnamon, tart apples, and pure, relentless survival. He knew the crippling, suffocating poverty this fragile woman lived in. He had seen her desolate, freezing cabin on the barren ridge. He knew the agonizing miles she had walked, through the dust, on paper-thin soles. He instantly recognized the profound, quiet, diamond-hard strength it took to stand before this vicious, mocking town and offer something beautifully crafted when they had given her absolutely nothing but ashes and cruel isolation. He dug the silver fork gently into the pastry, lifting a generous piece. The entire, bustling fairground held its collective breath, watching in stunned, absolute fascination as the legendary, terrifying giant of the high timber deliberately tasted the despised, forsaken widow's humble offering. He closed his eyes for a brief, silent moment. The intense flavors exploded across his palate. The sharp, vibrant tartness of the wild heirloom apples. The rich, clean, undeniable sweetness of the wild honey she had desperately scraped from the woods. It was an absolute, undeniable masterpiece. It tasted like enduring warmth against a blizzard. It tasted like the memory of a safe home. It tasted like a fierce, relentless refusal to let the consuming darkness win. Callahan opened his eyes. He didn't look at the expectant crowd. He looked straight down into Elara's terrified, waiting, sorrowful dark eyes. A slow, subtle, incredibly tender softening completely altered the hard, rugged, dangerous lines of his weathered face. Perfection. He spoke the single word softly, but the deep, resonant timbre of his voice carried effortlessly across the silent, breathless dust. Elara let out a small, trembling, broken gasp, her delicate hands flying upward to cover her pale lips. A fresh, hot wave of tears entirely blurred her vision, but this time, they were absolutely not born of humiliation or despair. For the first time in 6 agonizing, desperately lonely months, someone had truly, clearly seen her. Someone had openly acknowledged the immense worth, the sheer effort, and the unyielding love she had poured into that single, dented tin pan. But Callahan wasn't finished. Not even close. He turned his massive, intimidating form back toward the silent crowd. His piercing hazel gaze swept slowly over the wealthy, arrogant townsfolk, pinning them down in the dirt like helpless insects trapped beneath a heavy pane of glass. He locked his intense eyes entirely on the cowardly mayor, who was currently cowering like a beaten dog behind the portly bank manager. "You lied." Callahan's voice rose, violently shedding its quiet restraint, rolling out over the captive crowd like a heavy, booming thunderclap echoing off the distant mountains. "You stood right here before this entire town. You tasted absolute perfection, and you cowardly lied to protect your own pathetic, fragile pride." The mayor sputtered wildly, his face turning red, as he desperately tried to regain a tiny shred of his completely shattered public authority. "Now you listen here, Callahan. You do not run things down here in Oakhaven. That is my official professional judgment. We have strict standards. We have a state official here today, and he entirely agrees with me." The mayor gestured wildly, his trembling hand pointing toward a quiet, bespectacled man, standing at the very back of the judging procession. Judge Parker had traveled all the long, exhausting way from the state capital in Cheyenne, strictly to oversee the regional agricultural exhibits, but the arrogant local politicians had rudely pushed him to the absolute rear all afternoon, desperately eager to control the narrative and award their own wives. Judge Parker looked absolutely terrified to suddenly find himself the exact center of the giant cowboy's wrathful, focused attention. Callahan's heavy boots hit the hard dirt with loud, deliberate, terrifying thuds as he walked straight past the mayor, heading directly toward the state judge. The wealthy crowd desperately scrambled entirely out of his path, like frightened field mice, fleeing the shadow of a diving hawk. He stopped directly in front of Judge Parker, completely towering over the small, nervous man. Callahan didn't threaten him. He didn't raise his hand. He simply extended his massive, muscular arm, pointing a thick, scarred finger straight back toward Elara's quiet table. "Do your job. Taste the truth." Judge Parker swallowed nervously, quickly adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles on the bridge of his nose. He nodded frantically, scurrying out from behind the corrupt politicians who offered him no protection. He walked briskly up to Elara's table, offering her a surprisingly polite, genuinely apologetic nod before producing a clean, silver spoon from his own tailored waistcoat pocket. He dipped it carefully into the pie, capturing a perfectly balanced piece of the spiced apple filling and the golden, crumbling crust. He placed it slowly in his mouth. The silence stretched tight across the fairgrounds, buzzing with intense electric tension. Judge Parker chewed very slowly. His eyes widened significantly behind his thick glass lenses. He tasted another bite, then, deliberately, a third. He completely ignored the furious, glaring, hateful eyes of Mrs. Gable and the completely humiliated mayor. He turned slowly to face the waiting crowd, drawing his small frame up to its absolute full official height. "In all my long years traveling this vast territory," Judge Parker's voice rang out clear, loud, and strictly professional, "Mott have absolutely never encountered a more exquisite, expertly balanced pastry. The brilliant, resourceful use of wild honey instead of processed cane sugar adds a profound depth of flavor that is simply unmatched by any other entry presented here today. The baking technique is absolutely flawless." Judge Parker deliberately turned his back on the furious local elite and smiled warmly directly at Elara. "Madam, it is my absolute, undeniable honor to officially declare your spiced honey apple pie the undisputed grand champion of the Oakhaven County Fair." The words hung suspended in the hot autumn air, echoing brightly off the heavy canvas tents. For a single split second, total, paralyzing disbelief gripped the arrogant crowd. And then, before the corrupt mayor could shout a single pathetic objection, before Mrs. Gable could open her mouth to hurl another vicious, poisonous insult, a sound erupted that violently shook the very foundations of the fairgrounds. It was a roar. Callahan threw his massive dark head back and let out a booming, thunderous bellow of absolute, unadulterated triumph. It was a massive cheer, so incredibly loud, so deeply, profoundly powerful. It violently rattled the tin cups sitting on the neighboring tables, and instantly silenced the nervous whinnying of the heavy draft horses out in the far pens. He cheered louder than 100 men. He brought his enormous, heavily calloused hands together, the sudden sharp sound cracking exactly like heavy rifle fire, echoing across the open prairie. Mott met proud. He roared the words at the top of his immense lungs, making absolutely sure every single miserable soul in Oakhaven heard his undeniable, fiercely protective declaration. He didn't just quietly support her stunning victory. He claimed absolute, fierce pride in it, wrapping his terrifying, legendary reputation entirely around her fragile, hard-won victory like an impenetrable steel vault. The wealthy elite flinched physically, stepping backward, their ears literally ringing from the sheer, overwhelming volume of his booming joy. No one dared to argue. No one dared to utter a single negative syllable, while the terrifying giant of the high timber was actively standing guard over the delicate, forsaken widow. Elara stood completely motionless, her exhausted mind reeling in absolute, joyous shock. The suffocating, heavy weight of the town's relentless hatred, the absolute terror of the impending, freezing winter, the crushing, silent loneliness of her desolate cabin. It all temporarily vanished in the overwhelming wake of that thundering, fiercely protective cheer. She stared up at Callahan. The fearsome giant, the man the entire territory deeply feared, was grinning. It was a small, fiercely proud, stunningly warm smile that entirely softened the hard, dangerous lines of his weathered face, and it was meant entirely, exclusively for her. Judge Parker reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a crisp, brand-new $5 bill. He placed it incredibly gently on the splintered wood, right next to the dented tin pan. The money was real. Her immediate survival was fully secured. Elara reached out with wildly trembling, delicate fingers, lightly touching the paper. It felt rough, incredibly heavy, and absolutely miraculous. She pulled it tightly to her chest, her pale knuckles turning stark white, her slender shoulders shaking violently as silent, profound, heavy sobs of total relief finally broke through her diamond-hard, unyielding composure. Callahan instantly stepped back to her side, his massive, imposing presence seamlessly returning to a quiet, intensely watchful guard. He looked out at the townspeople, his hazel eyes hardening once more into sharp chips of dark flint. They were glaring at Elara with naked, highly toxic, undeniable hatred. The banker's wife looked as though she might physically burst from pure, unadulterated, bitter spite. They had been publicly humiliated. Their entire twisted, corrupt social order had been shattered by a wild man they could control, and they would absolutely never forgive Elara for being the catalyst of their embarrassment. Callahan knew this town. He knew the dark hearts of these men. He knew the vicious, cowardly, inevitable retribution they would enact the absolute second he rode his horse out of sight. He looked slowly down at the incredibly fragile, exhausted woman standing beside him. She had her prize money, but she was still utterly alone, carrying a massive invisible target painted clearly on her thin back. He watched a violent, uncontrollable shiver suddenly rack her petite frame as the intense adrenaline of the confrontation slowly faded, leaving her totally exhausted and highly vulnerable to the biting, shifting autumn wind. "We are leaving." His voice was a soft, deep rumble, strictly meant only for her ears. He didn't ask for her permission. He didn't offer a polite suggestion. It was a quiet, absolute, unyielding command born of pure, fierce protective instinct. He gently reached out and picked up the dented tin pie pan, holding the humble, incredibly precious heirloom in his massive, rough hand, with vastly more deep reverence than a priest holding a holy relic. With his free hand, he gently hovered his thick, warm fingers right over the small of her back, never actually touching her worn dress, but instantly creating a solid, undeniable, fiercely protective barrier between her fragile spine and the glaring, hostile crowd. Elara didn't hesitate for a single second. She didn't look back at the furious, defeated faces of the cruel town that had completely discarded her. She simply let the massive, surprisingly gentle giant completely guide her away from the livestock pens, stepping away from the cruel whispers and walking out onto the main, dusty thoroughfare. They walked in total silence, the dramatic, unbelievable size difference drawing absolutely every single eye in Oakhaven. The top of her head came up to barely past his massive elbow. He walked intentionally slowly, dramatically shortening his massive, sweeping strides to match her exhausted, trembling, faltering steps. When they finally reached the very edge of the town limits, the noise of the cruel fair faded completely into the soft, rushing whispers of the dry prairie grass. The wind suddenly picked up violently, carrying the bitter, unmistakable, freezing chill of impending heavy snow. Elara's adrenaline completely crashed. Her vision blurred and swam wildly. The brutal, unforgiving exhaustion of the past week, the agonizing miles she had walked on empty, burning lungs, and the extreme emotional whiplash of the day all slammed into her frail body at exactly the same time. Her knees buckled completely beneath her. She began to fall rapidly toward the hard, unforgiving dirt road. Before she could even register the terrifying sensation of falling, a massive, incredibly warm, solid arm swept firmly around her thin waist. Callahan caught her with shocking, unbelievable gentleness, lifting her effortlessly against the heavy, warm canvas of his dark, duster coat. She was so incredibly light, feeling like absolutely nothing more than a tiny bundle of fragile winter twigs resting against his immense, solid barrel chest. He looked fiercely down at her pale, utterly exhausted face, his thick jaw clenching with fierce, terrifying resolve. He looked out toward the distant, barren ridge where her desolate, freezing cabin sat exposed to the wind, and then he looked high up toward the distant, heavily timbered mountains where his own, secure, highly fortified ranch lay completely hidden from the cruel world. He pulled her slightly closer, the immense, radiating heat of his massive body immediately surrounding her freezing, shaking, exhausted frame. "You're not going back to that ridge." The deep, rumbling, absolute certainty in his commanding voice sent a sudden, wild, completely unexpected spike of pure panic straight through Elara's exhausted mind. If she was to going back to the only broken home she had left, where on this unforgiving, terrifying earth was this giant taking her? Now, you have to truly understand the sheer, blinding terror that immediately flooded Elara's exhausted mind the absolute second those massive words left Callahan's lips. You see, when a person has been systematically hunted, broken, and relentlessly discarded by every single soul they have ever trusted, the sudden, unexpected promise of safety feels exactly like a trap. Her delicate, fragile mind could not possibly comprehend the idea of genuine sanctuary. As Callahan held her incredibly slight, shivering frame securely against his immense chest, a wild, frantic surge of pure adrenaline violently pierced through her crushing fatigue. She gasped sharply, her pale, trembling hands instinctively pushing against the heavy, solid canvas of his dark duster coat. She felt like a desperate, trapped sparrow, fluttering uselessly against an unyielding, cast-iron cage. She had to get back to the ridge. She had to get back to her freezing, desolate, rattling cabin. It was a miserable, highly dangerous shell of a home, but it was the only tiny fraction of the world she still possessed, the only place where she could hide her shattered heart from the glaring, highly toxic eyes of Oakhaven. "Please," she whispered, the fragile sound violently torn away by the rapidly rising autumn wind. "You must put me down. Mort have to go back. Mort have the money now. Mort can pay the bank. Mort can survive." Callahan did not loosen his fierce, protective grip by even a single fraction of an inch. He looked deeply down into her wildly panicked dark eyes, instantly recognizing the profound, agonizing trauma completely driving her desperate pleas. He didn't argue with her. He didn't waste useless breath, trying to logically explain his actions to a woman who was actively drowning in sheer panic. He simply let out a sharp, piercing whistle that instantly cut cleanly through the howling gale. A massive, towering draft cross horse, a beast nearly as legendary and heavily muscled as its master, trotted heavily out from the shadows of the fairground perimeter, its massive hooves thudding rhythmically against the hard-packed dirt. Callahan effortlessly lifted Elara higher against his chest, completely ignoring her weak, frantic struggles, and moved powerfully toward the waiting animal. He secured the precious, dented tin pie pan carefully inside one of his heavy leather saddlebags, treating the battered object with extreme, meticulous reverence. Then, with a single, incredibly fluid motion of shocking strength, he hoisted Elara's tiny, lightweight body straight up into the air and deposited her gently onto the vast, worn leather saddle. The sheer height of the massive horse made her violently dizzy. She swayed dangerously, her completely exhausted muscles utterly failing her, before she could tip sideways and fall the terrifying distance to the freezing ground. Callahan swung his immense, towering frame up directly behind her. He didn't crowd her. He didn't touch her inappropriately, but his massive, solid chest instantly became an immovable, incredibly hot wall of radiating warmth directly at her back. He reached his incredibly thick, heavily muscled arms around her sides to grasp the thick leather reins, intentionally bracketing her completely inside a secure, impregnable fortress of extreme physical protection. The town of Oakhaven, with its cruel mayor, its vicious bankeress wife, and its highly toxic, hateful whispers, immediately shrank behind them as Callahan spurred the massive horse forward. They rode rapidly away from the suffocating dust, heading straight toward the vast, open, rolling prairie. The temperature was actively plummeting, the sky bruising into a violent, dark purple as an early, brutal snowstorm rapidly gathered over the jagged northern peaks. Elara sat rigidly stiff, her violently trembling hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her delicate knuckles ached deeply. She stared out across the fading landscape, utterly terrified, desperately waiting for the massive horse to turn toward the desolate eastern ridge where her lonely cabin sat. But Callahan never pulled the reins to the east. He kept the horse driving powerfully forward, heading straight toward the immense, deeply shadowed, highly treacherous timberlines of the high mountains. Elara watched in silent, paralyzing horror as the faint, distant outline of her dilapidated wooden cabin completely disappeared into the darkening horizon. He was taking her away. He was actively stealing her from the only miserable life she knew. She opened her mouth to scream, To fiercely demand he turn the massive beast around. But the freezing wind violently stole her breath, and the extreme unrelenting exhaustion, finally, completely conquered her diamond-hard resilience. The terrifying, agonizing events of the day completely overwhelmed her fragile nervous system. Her heavy, dark eyelashes fluttered uselessly against her pale cheeks. Her slender, fragile body went totally limp, completely collapsing against the massive, solid wall of Callahan's broad chest. She drifted in and out of a dark, suffocating unconsciousness for hours. She didn't feel the steep, dangerous incline of the Rocky Mountain trails. She didn't feel the sudden, violent bite of the first heavy snowflakes whipping aggressively through the high alpine air. All she felt was the steady, incredibly powerful, deep rhythmic beating of a massive heart directly behind her shoulder blades. All she smelled was the comforting, deeply masculine scent of weathered leather, old pine, and clean, winter wind wrapped entirely around her. It was the absolute first time in 6 agonizing months she hadn't felt the deep bone-chilling cold of total isolation. When Elara finally, painfully drifted back toward the waking world, the violent, howling wind was completely gone. She lay utterly still, deeply buried beneath a massive, incredibly heavy mound of thick, luxurious black bear furs. A profound, radiating, intense heat soaked straight through her chilled, frail bones. She slowly fluttered her dark eyes open, her confused gaze immediately catching the bright, dancing, golden light of a massive, roaring fire heavily burning inside a gigantic river stone hearth. She was no longer on the terrifying back of the giant draft horse. She was lying securely in the center of an immense, deeply comfortable bed inside a cabin that looked absolutely nothing like her own broken, drafty shell. This was an impregnable, high mountain fortress. The massive walls were constructed from incredibly thick, whole-stripped pine logs seamlessly fitted together to form an absolute barrier against the violent winter world outside. The heavy wooden floors were meticulously clean, covered in thick, woven wool rugs. The entire space smelled incredibly rich, filled with the deep, comforting aroma of burning cedar wood smoke and strong, dark roasted coffee. Elara carefully pushed the heavy furs down just below her chin, her wide, completely terrified eyes darting wildly around the beautifully constructed room, and then she saw him. Callahan stood silently across the room, near a heavy, scarred oak table. He had removed his heavy, trail-dusted canvas duster coat, revealing a dark, thick woolen flannel shirt stretching incredibly tightly across his massively broad, heavily corded shoulders. He looked utterly colossal inside the enclosed space, a terrifying giant of a man completely dominating his environment. But he was doing anything frightening. He was looming over her. He was demanding anything from her. He was standing completely still, his massive back turned slightly away, deeply focused on a highly specific task. Elara held her fragile breath, silently watching his massive scarred hands moving with shocking, agonizing slowness. He was holding her dented, blackened tin pie pan. He had taken a clean, soft white cloth, and he was meticulously, incredibly gently wiping away every single tiny speck of residual flour, dried apple, and sticky honey from the battered metal surface. He handled the cheap, ruined object as if he were carefully polishing a priceless crown jewel. The extreme, stark visual contrast of this legendary, deeply feared apex predator, delicately cleaning the forsaken widow's only precious heirloom, completely shattered Elara's fragile expectations. She watched, utterly mesmerized, as Callahan slowly walked across the heavy wooden floor, his massive boots making surprisingly little noise. He approached the gigantic riverstone fireplace. In the absolute center of the thick, polished oak mantel sat a highly pristine, obviously expensive, imported brass clock. Callahan reached out his massive hand, casually shoving the expensive clock entirely to the far side of the mantel, aggressively discarding it to the shadows. Then, with an extreme, profound, deliberate reverence, he perfectly centered Elara's dented tin pie pan directly in the exact middle of the mantel, placing it directly over the warmest, brightest light of the roaring fire. He elevated her trauma. He publicly honored her quiet, desperate struggle. Without uttering a single spoken word, he had taken the absolute symbol of her extreme poverty, the exact object the cruel town had viciously mocked, and he had permanently installed it as the absolute centerpiece of his highly secure home. A sharp, violent, completely uncontrollable sob physically tore its way up through Elara's incredibly tight, restricted throat. The sudden agonizing sound echoed loudly through the quiet, safe cabin. Callahan instantly froze. His massive, broad shoulders tensed sharply. He turned very slowly, his piercing, watchful hazel eyes locking immediately onto her small, fragile face, peeking out from beneath the massive black furs. The hard, dangerous lines of his heavily bearded, rugged jaw instantly softened. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't crowd her space. He deliberately kept a vast, deeply respectful distance between his towering frame and her highly vulnerable position on the bed. Drink. His voice was a deep, low, incredibly soothing rumble that seemed to vibrate directly through the heavy floorboards. He slowly pointed a thick, heavily scarred finger toward a small, incredibly sturdy wooden stool sitting right next to the edge of the bed. Resting on top of the stool was a steaming, heavy ceramic mug filled with deeply rich, highly restorative bone broth. Elara stared at the mug. The incredible, savory smell aggressively assaulted her starving senses, making her utterly hollow stomach cramp violently with sheer, desperate need. But the crippling, deeply ingrained trauma of her past violently held her perfectly still. The town had ruthlessly taught her that absolutely nothing in this world was ever freely given. Every single act of charity came tightly wrapped in a vicious, suffocating snare of cruel obligation or crushing debt. She looked frantically up at the towering giant cowboy. She saw his immense, unbelievable size. She saw the heavy iron revolver resting casually on the table behind him. A fresh, highly toxic wave of pure panic fiercely hijacked her completely exhausted mind. She couldn't stay here. If the corrupt men of Oakhaven discovered she was completely alone up in the high mountains with the legendary giant, they would utterly destroy whatever tiny, miserable shred of a reputation she still had left. They would brand her a ruined woman. They would use it as the absolute final excuse to completely steal her meager property and throw her permanently into the freezing wilderness to die. Her wildly traumatized mind could not process his pure, protective intentions. She only saw extreme, imminent danger to her totally fragile survival. Moat can tea. She gasped the words frantically, her delicate hands violently shoving the heavy bear furs completely off her slight, completely trembling body. She swung her remarkably thin legs over the side of the massive bed, her worn, incredibly battered leather boots hitting the thick wool rug. She forced her utterly exhausted, starving body to stand. A massive wave of sheer dizziness aggressively slammed into her skull, tilting the entire room sideways. She stumbled heavily, her completely drained muscles screaming in violent protest, but her sheer, diamond, hard inner resilience fiercely forced her to take a desperate, highly erratic step toward the heavy oak front door. Moat cannot be here. Moat must go back. Moat can pay them. Moat have to go back to my house. Callahan watched her frantic, deeply agonizing struggle with absolute, heartbreaking clarity. He saw the extreme, suffocating terror shining completely unfiltered in her wide, beautiful dark eyes. He didn't move to physically grab her. He knew his massive, terrifying strength would instantly shatter her completely fractured trust. Instead, he simply took two incredibly long, deliberate, powerfully sweeping strides, completely across the room, seamlessly placing his towering, heavily muscled body directly in front of the heavy oak door. He didn't cross his massive arms. He didn't adopt an aggressive, threatening posture. He simply stood there, an absolute, totally, immovable mountain of a man, gently, but completely physically blocking her only avenue of escape. You have absolutely nothing to go back to. His voice remained completely low, stripped entirely of any anger, but intensely loaded with undeniable, devastating truth. The quiet, absolute certainty in his deep rumble violently pierced straight through her frantic, terrified haze. Yes, Mont, do. Elara sobbed fiercely, her petite, highly fragile body shaking violently as she desperately stopped Uete 3 feet away from his massive chest. Moat have my home. Moat have my husband's cabin. It is mine. Callahan stared deeply down at her flushed, highly terrified face. He saw the profound, tragic delusion she was frantically clinging to. He hated the deeply corrupt, vicious men of Oakhaven with absolute, unfiltered rage, but he absolutely hated what they had done to this incredibly resilient, fragile woman even more. He knew he had to violently break her terrible illusion in order to completely save her life. It was never yours. Callahan spoke the words with extreme, agonizing gentleness, slowly reaching into the deep pocket of his thick flannel shirt. He pulled out a crumpled, heavily stamped piece of official parchment. He held it carefully out toward her wildly trembling, delicate hands. Mayor Higgins and the bank foreclosed on the Ridge property 3 days ago. They legally sealed the paperwork while you were completely exhausting yourself, walking entirely through the bitter cold to bake that pie. They never actually planned to let you survive the winter. They were actively waiting for the heavy snows to simply freeze you out. Elara stared completely blankly at the official, legally stamped document suspended in his massive, scarred hand. The highly suffocating, totally devastating reality violently crashed down upon her incredibly fragile shoulders. The desperately miserable, violently drafty, terribly lonely cabin. The broken plow, the completely empty flour bin. It was all utterly gone. The tiny, highly painful world she had violently fought so desperately hard to keep had been cruelly secretly stolen from her days ago. The vicious, highly toxic men of the town had completely, utterly destroyed her. She had absolutely nothing. She was completely, totally destitute. She was a ghost. The crisp, new $5 bill she had desperately clutched so fiercely in her pocket was absolutely worthless. It couldn't buy back a stolen property. Her legs finally, completely gave out. The sheer, crushing, absolute weight of total defeat aggressively snapped her deeply exhausted, fragile resilience entirely in half. She began to completely collapse toward the hard wooden floor. A totally shattered, violently weeping, completely broken survivor, finally surrendering entirely to the horrific darkness. But she never hit the floor. Callahan moved with terrifying, unbelievable, highly predatory speed. In a tiny fraction of a second, he dropped the completely worthless, legal document and violently swept his massive, incredibly powerful arms entirely around her collapsing, fragile form. He pulled her incredibly tight, shockingly light body forcefully against his immense, wildly radiating, deeply protective chest. He didn't just catch her. He aggressively absorbed her completely entirely into his own massive strength. Let it go. He whispered the fierce, deeply rumbling command directly into her soft, wildly trembling hair. He wrapped his gigantic, heavily muscled arms entirely around her incredibly thin shoulders, violently crushing the suffocating darkness completely away from her mind. You are absolutely done surviving them. You are deeply safe here. Mort will completely tear the absolute heart out of any man who ever tries to touch you again. Elara completely shattered. The profoundly deep, highly violent sobs she had desperately choked back for 6 totally agonizing months finally erupted completely from her deeply scarred chest. She buried her completely exhausted, highly terrified face directly into the warm, heavy flannel, covering his massively beating heart. Her delicate fingers violently curling directly into his thick shirt like a totally drowning sailor, desperately clinging entirely to a solid oak mast. She completely surrendered her immense, terrible burden directly into the total, uncompromising, heavily guarded safety of the massive, fiercely protective mountain man. Callahan held her incredibly gently, violently resting his massive, heavy chin completely over the top of her dark head. He stood totally rooted to the floor, actively becoming an absolute, deeply impenetrable fortress entirely for her highly shattered soul. He let her completely empty, her totally terrified, highly broken heart, deeply absorbing every single agonizing, highly violent tear completely into his own quiet, fiercely unyielding strength. For a deeply profound, incredibly long span of time, the only sound inside the absolutely secure cabin was the violent, highly rhythmic crackling of the massive fire and the completely soft, entirely exhausted weeping of the deeply delicate woman, permanently safely anchored against his immense, totally unwavering chest. She was finally, completely breaking, but for the absolute first time in her incredibly tragic life, she was entirely breaking inside a highly protected, profoundly safe space where absolute healing could finally begin. But the deeply corrupt, highly toxic darkness of Oakhaven was not so easily defeated. Callahan's deeply sensitive, highly attuned ears suddenly twitched. His massive body instantly went completely rigid beneath Elara's violently trembling hands. He deeply felt the vibration traveling entirely up through the solid wooden floorboards, long before he actually heard the highly ominous, deeply terrifying sound, completely cutting straight through the violently howling winds outside. It was the incredibly loud, highly aggressive, rapidly approaching thunder of a dozen heavily armed men, actively pushing their exhausted horses violently up the deeply treacherous mountain trail, coming directly straight for his absolute sanctuary. Listen to me closely, friends, because there is a very specific, terrifying kind of sound in this world that shatters the soul once you have known the true cruelty of men. It isn't the howling of the timber wolves up on the high ridges, and it certainly is the deep rumbling thunder that rolls across the vast Wyoming prairie before a massive storm. It is the rhythmic, heavy, aggressive drumming of approaching horses. It is the sound of iron horseshoes striking the frozen, hard-packed earth, sounding exactly like a dozen blacksmith hammers, relentlessly smashing against the fragile cage of your own ribs. It is the undeniable, suffocating sound of a corrupt frontier mob actively hunting down their chosen prey. That terrible, heavy noise ripped through the profound, sacred silence that had just barely begun to settle inside the massive, highly fortified walls of Callahan's mountain sanctuary. It was not merely a physical disruption echoing through the bitter alpine air. It was the dark, toxic echo of a merciless past, reaching its foul hands straight up the treacherous mountain trail, desperately attempting to drag the incredibly fragile, destitute widow right back down into the freezing mud of her despair. In a single heartbeat, every trace of the profound, tender softening that had just warmed the rugged, weathered lines of the giant cowboy's face vanished. He did not simply change his expression, he physically transformed. The immensely broad, corded muscles across his massive back instantly turned to solid, unyielding granite beneath his thick flannel shirt. The fierce, ingrained instincts of an apex predator, the very same primal, dangerous instincts that had kept him alive through countless brutal, unforgiving winters in the highest, most isolated peaks of the territory, roared to life inside his blood. He felt the chaotic, aggressive vibrations, traveling straight up through the thick, meticulously polished oak floorboards long before the swirling, freezing blizzard outside could carry the harsh, arrogant shouts of the approaching men to his ears. But he did not panic. He did not suddenly scramble across the large room to snatch up the heavy, fully loaded Winchester rifle resting against the far wall. He ignored the massive iron revolver sitting entirely unguarded on the heavy wooden table. Instead, his massive, calloused hands simply tightened vacate hat extreme, profound gentleness around Elara's violently shaking, slight shoulders. He intentionally, deliberately created an immovable physical anchor for her fragile, terrified mind amidst the suddenly crashing wave of panic. Elara's breath hitched, locking tightly inside her constricted, exhausted chest. The delicate, miraculously safe, unprecedented sanctuary she had just briefly tasted was violently crumbling into jagged pieces around her. She knew that terrible, aggressive sound intimately. It was the unmistakable, arrogant thunder of a hastily formed, corrupt frontier posse riding to enforce their own twisted version of local law. The arrogant, toxic men of Oakhaven had not simply swallowed their bitter pride and accepted their humiliating, public defeat at the county fair. Their fragile, pathetic egos had been shattered before the eyes of the entire surrounding territory, and their immediate, cowardly response was to rapidly gather overwhelming, heavily armed numbers. They intended to drag the forsaken, exhausted woman straight back into their cruel, suffocating grasp. They wanted to punish her simply for daring to survive. They came for me. The frantic, terrified whisper tore its way past Elara's pale, trembling lips. The sound was so slight, so fragile, it sounded exactly like dry winter leaves crushed beneath a heavy boot. Her deep, sorrowful dark eyes widened in sheer, blinding panic, instantly losing the tiny, delicate spark of safety that Callahan had just miraculously managed to ignite deep within her shattered soul. The deep, instinctual, desperate urge to flee overtook her exhausted body. She wildly tried to pull her slight frame away from his broad, radiating chest. Her traumatized, frantic mind immediately commanded her to run, to desperately seek out the deepest, darkest, coldest corner of the massive log cabin, and to curl her fragile, broken body into an invisible ball. She fully expected the towering, terrifying giant mountain man to react exactly the way every single other harsh, callous man on the unforgiving frontier would react. She expected him to thrust her aside, to roar in sudden anger, to grab his heavy iron weapons, and to harshly demand she stay out of his way while he engaged in a brutal, bloody shootout on her behalf. She was conditioned to believe she was nothing more than a highly inconvenient, burdensome catalyst for violent destruction. Callahan did none of those expected, violent things. He moved with an agonizing, deliberate slowness that intentionally directly contrasted the frantic, aggressive, chaotic storm of armed men, rapidly multiplying just outside his massive, fortified oak door. He understood ve capite hat absolute clarity that any sudden, aggressive movement on his part would permanently shatter Elara's fragile, overwhelmed, damaged nervous system. He gently, securely shifted his massive muscled hands down her slender, shivering arms, carefully maintaining a solid, reassuring, unbroken physical connection. Then, with a shocking, beautiful display of controlled physical grace, the massive, towering giant slowly lowered his colossal frame. He patiently bent his thick, corded knees, lowering his whiskey-barrel chest until his piercing, watchful hazel eyes were exactly, perfectly level with her, wildly terrified, actively weeping dark eyes. "Look directly at me." His deep, remarkably steady, calm voice was a highly localized, powerful, rumbling tremor. It smoothly cut through the rising, panicked buzzing that was echoing inside her traumatized mind. It was not a harsh, demanding order. It was a fiercely absolute, protective, intensely gentle plea demanding her total, undivided trust. It was the sound of an immovable mountain, actively promising to shelter a desperate sparrow. Elara forced her shaking, tear-filled gaze directly up into his weathered, intensely serious, heavily scarred face. She desperately searched his rugged, intimidating features for any fleeting sign of impending rage or bitter regret for having saved her. She found nothing of the sort. There was no anger directed at her. There was only profound, unwavering, stoic, comforting certainty. "What promised you that you are deeply, profoundly safe here?" He spoke the heavy, weighted words with such unyielding conviction that they physically resonated in the quiet, still air surrounding their two contrasting bodies. "You will not hide in the dark like a hunted, frightened animal. You will walk slowly over to that massive hearth. You will sit securely, safely in my chair. You will focus on watching the warm fire. Mott am going to step outside, and Mott am going to permanently end this ridiculous, pathetic, cowardly disturbance. Do you understand me?" Elara could only manage a tiny, trembling, jerky, fragile nod of her exhausted head. The sheer, overwhelming, undeniable magnitude of his absolute, unyielding, intensely protective calm actively forced her panicked, racing heart to slightly, marginally slow its frantic, terrifying beating against her delicate ribs. She allowed him to gently, heavily guide her away from the dangerous vicinity of the massive oak door. His thick, scarred, warm hand firmly, securely rested against the small, fragile curve of her tense back. He smoothly, patiently escorted her across the large, secure, warm room, deliberately leading her far away from the chaotic darkness outside. He carefully, gently settled her slight, shivering, exhausted frame deeply into the center of a massive, worn, oversized leather armchair that was situated perfectly next to the roaring, crackling, hot, river-stone fire. He tucked a massive, heavy, warm woolen blanket around her fragile, slender shoulders, actively ensuring she was insulated from any lingering chill in the deep mountain air. He elevated her status in his home, actively placing her in his own highly personal space of ultimate comfort, silently reinforcing his unwavering commitment to her physical and emotional preservation. The second she was perfectly secure, bundled in the heavy wool and bathed in the protective, dancing golden light of the massive fire, a heavy, aggressive, demanding pounding violently struck the thick, seamlessly fitted logs of the front door. "Callahan, open this door immediately." The harsh, arrogant, demanding, grating voice of Mayor Higgins pierced directly through the groaning, frozen timber. It was a cowardly, pathetic, nasal sound, artificially emboldened by the heavily armed, aggressive presence of the large mounted posse standing directly behind him in the swirling, freezing, unforgiving alpine snowstorm. The corrupt politician actually believed his hollow, fabricated town authority somehow miraculously extended up into the wild, sovereign, untamed territory of the towering mountain man. Callahan did not rush to answer the demanding, insulting, arrogant call. He intentionally ignored his heavy, protective canvas duster coat, hanging closely nearby on an iron hook. He deliberately, calmly, fearlessly walked directly back toward the heavily fortified oak door, wearing absolutely nothing to protect himself from the bitter, freezing elements but his worn, faded denim trousers and his thick, tightly stretched, dark flannel shirt. He explicitly, intentionally left his heavy, loaded iron revolver resting on the distant wooden table, far out of his own massive reach. He fully intended to confront the heavily armed, toxic, aggressive posse completely, absolutely unarmed. This was a profound, strategic, calculated choice born of absolute, supreme physical dominance. He knew that if he brought a weapon, he would instantly validate their pathetic, cowardly threat. He would be playing their corrupt, violent, predictable game. He would not taint the sacred, profound safety of Elara's new, permanent sanctuary with senseless, cheap, chaotic frontier bloodshed. He knew the devastating, paralyzing psychological power of absolute, unyielding, immensely dominant, unarmed physical intimidation. He intended to break their false, fragile courage entirely with his overwhelming, monstrous physical presence alone. He reached out his massive, calloused, bare hand and smoothly, quietly, effortlessly threw back the heavily forged, solid, thick iron deadbolt. When Callahan actively hauled the massive, reinforced, heavy oak door wide open, he did not simply step lightly, politely out onto the deep, snow-covered wooden porch. He intentionally, aggressively surged forward, violently filling the massive, wide wooden doorframe with the sheer, undeniable, overwhelming, muscular, towering bulk of his colossal, intensely intimidating body. The extreme, sudden absolute visual shock of his towering, massive, unbothered appearance instantly silenced the heavily armed, demanding, arrogant crowd gathered in the freezing, swirling, brutal snowstorm. The biting, freezing mountain wind instantly shrieked, tearing across the open clearing, whipping the dark, heavy snow around his incredibly broad, unshielded shoulders. He did not shiver. He did not flinch. He did not react to the painful, freezing bite of the heavy storm in any visible way. He simply stood there, a terrifying, immovable, massive monument of pure, unadulterated, lethal frontier power. There were exactly 12 men sitting nervously, awkwardly atop heavily blowing, shivering, exhausted horses crowding the small, snow-covered, isolated clearing located directly in front of his fortified, impenetrable cabin. Mayor Higgins sat awkwardly, visibly trembling, atop a highly expensive, unsuitable, foolish riding saddle, desperately clutching the thick frozen leather reins with gloved, violently trembling, pathetic hands. Beside him sat the highly corrupt, vicious town sheriff, holding a dangerous, fully loaded, heavy Winchester rifle resting across his thick lap. They had confidently, arrogantly expected to wildly shout, intimidating, demanding, violent threats through a locked, barred, closed wooden door. They had never, in their pathetic, sheltered lives, expected the terrifying, legendary, massive giant of the high timber to step directly out into the freezing, biting, unforgiving tempest, utterly unaffected by the brutal elements, completely unarmed, and looking ready to tear them all apart with his bare, calloused, massive hands. The undeniable extreme size difference immediately destroyed their false, pathetic, cowardly bravery. Callahan intentionally, slowly crossed his thick, heavily corded, muscular, scarred arms precisely across his vastly expansive, unyielding barrel chest. His incredibly piercing, intensely watchful hazel eyes locked onto the shivering, terrified face of the corrupt mayor, burning with a cold, relentless promise of absolute destruction that required no bullets to enforce. The snow continued to fall, burying the clearing in white, but the silence that stretched between the giant mountain man and the 12 armed riders was so heavy, so fraught with the promise of doom, that even the wind seemed to hold its breath waiting to see which man would foolishly choose to die first. Listen very closely to the howling wind, my friends, because out here on the unforgiving frontier, the wind is the only true judge of a man's character. It strips away the fine-tailored suits, it blows away the arrogant titles, and it leaves absolutely nothing but the raw, unfiltered truth of who you really are. The violent, shrieking blizzard had completely engulfed the small, isolated clearing, directly in front of Callahan's massive log cabin. It actively whipped millions of sharp, freezing ice crystals against the 12 heavily armed men sitting atop their exhausted, shivering horses. The extreme, biting cold aggressively penetrated their heavy woolen coats, sinking its invisible teeth directly into their corrupt, cowardly bones. But the true source of their sudden, paralyzing terror did not come from the rapidly dropping temperature or the blinding snow. It came entirely from the towering, immensely broad, completely unarmed giant standing unbothered on the deep, snow-covered wooden porch. Callahan stood still as an ancient monolith, an immovable mountain of corded muscle and highly lethal contained potential. He wore no heavy winter coat. His thick, dark flannel shirt stretched tightly across his expansive, slowly heaving barrel chest, rapidly collecting a freezing layer of pure white snow across his broad, scarred shoulders. He did not shiver. He did not flinch. He entirely ignored the blinding, painful sting of the heavy ice, actively striking his exposed, weathered face. His intensely piercing, watchful hazel eyes locked onto the terrified, pale, sweaty face of Mayor Higgins, pinning the corrupt politician down beneath the crushing weight of pure, primal dominance. The suffocating silence stretching between them was heavier, colder, and vastly more dangerous than the brutal storm raging around them. You have to understand the psychology of a frontier mob to grasp the absolute panic setting in among these men. A posse like this is built entirely on the illusion of shared bravery. They gather in the warm, safe confines of a town saloon, drinking cheap whiskey, feeding off each other's loud voices, convincing themselves they are righteous men enforcing the law. They bully the weak because the weak cannot fight back. They had ridden up this treacherous mountain trail, expecting to find a cowering woman and a man who would either surrender to their overwhelming numbers or engage in a frantic, chaotic shootout from behind a locked door. They had planned to shout demanding threats, to use their tin badges and their dozen-loaded rifles to project an aura of invincible authority. They fundamentally believed that 12 men with guns could dictate the fate of the territory. They were utterly, catastrophically wrong. Facing them was not a man scrambling for cover. Facing them was the absolute apex predator of the Wyoming timberline, stepping willingly into the killing freeze with empty, bare hands. By refusing to bring his heavy iron revolver or his lever-action rifle out onto the porch, Callahan was delivering a profound, devastating psychological blow. He was stripping away their rules of engagement. He was telling them, without uttering a single syllable, that their weapons were entirely useless against him. He was projecting a level of supreme, terrifying confidence that shattered their fragile, whiskey-fueled courage into a million jagged pieces. The corrupt town sheriff swallowed hard, the pathetic, terrified sound audible even over the howling gale. His thick, gloved hands trembled violently against the cold, dark iron stock of his fully loaded Winchester rifle. He sat atop his restless, stamping horse, feeling the crushing weight of Callahan's stare burning a hole straight through his borrowed bravery. Instinctively, foolishly, the sheriff twitched his freezing fingers, actively attempting to slightly raise the heavy weapon toward the towering mountain man. He wanted to regain control. He wanted to prove he was the law. Callahan reacted instantly, but not with sudden, chaotic aggression. He did not dive for the wooden railings. He did not shout in anger. Deliberately, incredibly slowly, he took one massive, heavy, resounding step straight forward. He left the partial shelter of the heavy wooden awning and stepped entirely out into the blinding, freezing tempest. He intentionally placed his massive, exposed chest exactly at the absolute end of the sheriff's nervously twitching rifle barrel. He closed the distance, turning himself into a massive, impossible target. He dared the cowardly man to pull the cold trigger. He challenged the corrupt lawman to actively murder an unarmed, deeply respected, massive frontier giant in cold blood, right in front of 11 highly nervous, freezing witnesses. You pull that iron, sheriff, and you will never leave this high mountain alive. The words rolled out of Callahan's broad chest in a low, deep, rumbling tremor. The sound vibrated perfectly clearly through the violent wind, echoing like the terrifying, ominous groaning of an ancient pine tree right before it snaps in half. There was no wild, chaotic anger in his tone. There was no desperate shouting. It was simply an absolute, undeniable, cold statement of profound, guaranteed destructive fact. He was making a promise to the mountain itself. The sheer, overwhelming certainty embedded within his commanding voice shattered the sheriff's fragile courage instantly. The terrified lawman visibly shrank backward into his freezing leather saddle. His trembling hands instantly dropped the heavy rifle away, pointing the cold iron barrel straight down into the swirling snow. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, his wide eyes darting wildly toward the other men, silently begging someone else to take the lead. But the other deputies were completely frozen, their own weapons lowered, their horses shifting nervously beneath them. The animals could smell the raw, unyielding dominance radiating from the porch, and they wanted absolutely no part of this confrontation. Mayor Higgins frantically began to lose whatever tiny shred of composure he still possessed. His round, sweaty face contorted into a pathetic mask of pure, cowardly desperation. He had dragged these men up here to salvage his own bruised ego, to prove to the wealthy elites of Oakhaven that he could still control the outcasts and the weak. Now, sitting atop his expensive, totally unsuitable riding saddle, he realized he was staring directly into the abyss, and the abyss was staring right back at him with piercing hazel eyes. Shoot him. The mayor shrieked the command, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic squeal that was instantly swallowed by the roaring blizzard. He wildly waved his gloved hand toward the towering figure on the porch. He stole bank property. He kidnapped the widow. Mort am your legal authority. You must shoot this wild animal immediately. Mort command you to shoot him. Nobody moved. Nobody raised a single barrel. The deputies sat like frozen statues, their eyes locked in sheer terror on Callahan. They knew the truth. They knew the bank had stolen Elara's cabin through corrupt, legal loopholes. They knew Callahan had not kidnapped anyone. He had openly, publicly rescued a woman they had systematically tried to destroy. And more importantly, they knew that if a single shot rang out, this giant would cross the snowy clearing before the smoke cleared and tear them apart with his bare, calloused hands. Inside the massive, heavily fortified log cabin, a profoundly different battle was taking place. Elara sat completely rigid in the center of the oversized leather armchair. The thick, luxurious black bear furs were wrapped tightly around her slender, shivering shoulders, offering an immense, radiating heat that directly contrasted the terrifying, icy dread pooling in her stomach. She stared blindly at the roaring, crackling fire in the riverstone hearth. But her mind was entirely outside in the freezing storm. She heard the heavy, muffled shouts of the mayor. She recognized that high, nasal, arrogant voice. It was the voice of the man who had ordered her eviction, the man who had publicly humiliated her, the man who represented every single source of her agonizing trauma. Her heart hammered against her fragile ribs with the frantic, terrifying speed of a trapped hummingbird. Every single ingrained survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to throw off the heavy furs, to run to the back of the cabin, to crawl under the massive bed, and to hide in the suffocating darkness. The town had taught her that when violent men arrived, the only way to survive was to become completely invisible, to shrink into nothingness. But then, echoing through her panicked mind, came the deep, steady, intensely protective rumble of the giant cowboy's voice. Mort promised you that you are safely protected here. You will not hide in the dark like a hunted animal. Elara squeezed her deep, sorrowful, dark eyes shut. A single hot tear escaped, sliding rapidly down her pale cheek, catching the golden, dancing light of the flames. She gripped the arms of the leather chair, her delicate knuckles turning stark white. She took a deep, jagged breath, forcing the warm, wood-smoke-scented air deep into her burning lungs. She had spent 6 agonizing months hiding. She had spent half a year making herself small, accepting the town as cruel whispers, bowing her head in silent submission to their relentless abuse. And where had it gotten her? It had gotten her completely discarded, left to freeze on a barren ridge. She opened her eyes. The profound, diamond-like resilience that had kept her walking those agonizing miles to the fairgrounds. The quiet, unyielding strength that had allowed her to bake a perfect masterpiece from scraps of nothing flared brilliantly back to life in her shattered soul. She would not hide. Elara slowly pushed the heavy bare furs aside. She stood up on trembling, exhausted legs. The thick wool rug was soft beneath her worn leather boots. She moved across the quiet, dimly lit room, with agonizing, silent steps, approaching the heavily frosted front window, situated just to the right of the massive oak door. She raised her delicate, pale hand, and gently wiped away a small circle of the icy condensation, clouding the thick glass. She peered out into the violently swirling blizzard. The sight that greeted her completely stole the very breath from her lungs. She saw the dozen heavily armed men, their dark coats stark against the blinding white snow, their rifles glinting ominously in the muted light. She saw the corrupt mayor shrieking his cowardly orders. But none of that mattered. Her entire focus became completely captivated by the towering, massive silhouette, standing entirely between her and the venomous town. Callahan had not drawn a weapon. He stood completely exposed to the elements, his broad back an impenetrable wall of solid, corded muscle, shielding the cabin from the hatred outside. The snow was piling on his dark hair and broad shoulders, yet he remained an absolute, unwavering monument of protection. He was offering his Oakhaven massive body as a living, breathing shield. He was willing to take the bullets, to absorb the violence, to face down an entire corrupt town, all to ensure that the fragile, broken woman sitting inside his home would never be harmed again. Elara pressed her pale, trembling fingertips against the freezing glass. A profound, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated awe washed entirely over her, instantly extinguishing the icy dread in her stomach. She was witnessing a level of deep, honorable devotion she had never known existed. He was to fighting for pride. He was to fighting to prove his dominance. He was standing in the freezing storm, unarmed and unyielding, simply because he had promised her she was safe. The sheer, magnificent gravity of that realization initiated the first true, profound crack in the heavy armor of trauma surrounding her heart. Out on the snow-covered porch, Callahan decided this pathetic charade had gone on long enough. He slowly, deliberately uncrossed his massive scarred arms. The simple, subtle movement sent a massive jolt of fresh, electric terror straight through the frozen posse. He took one more heavy, crunching step down the wooden stairs, moving closer to the shivering, wide-eyed men. "Go home." The two words fell from his lips like heavy granite boulders smashing into a calm lake. He did not yell. He did not threaten them again. The absolute finality in his tone left absolutely no room for negotiation, argument, or debate. "If any man from Oakhaven ever steps foot on this ridge again, you will not leave it. Take your corrupt politicians, turn those shivering animals around, and ride back to the miserable hole you crawled out of, now." The profound, terrifying gravity of his absolute command broke the posse completely. The psychological warfare was entirely over. The illusion of their shared bravery evaporated into the freezing wind. The town sheriff, utterly defeated and entirely stripped of his false authority, aggressively yanked on his heavy leather reins, violently turning his frightened horse away from the towering mountain man. He did not say a single word. He did not look back. He simply spurred the animal forward, desperate to escape the suffocating aura of pure dominance. One by one, the other deputies followed suit. The collective relief of surrender washed over them. They hastily turned their shivering mounts, their expensive boots kicking snow as they scrambled to fall in line behind the retreating sheriff. Mayor Higgins was left sitting entirely alone at the front of the clearing, his mouth hanging open in complete, sputtering disbelief. His armed escort was abandoning him. His absolute power was dissolving in the bitter snow. He looked wildly around, his face purple ve capite hot, freezing cold and furious, impotent rage. "You cannot do this," he squeaked frantically, desperately yanking his horse around to follow his fleeing men. "Moat will send the state marshals. Moat will have you hanged, Callahan. You hear me? Hanged." Callahan simply stood in the deep snow, his massive chest slowly heaving with calm, steady breaths, watching the pathetic, round man struggle to keep his terrified horse from bucking him into the drifts. He didn't even dignify the desperate, hollow threats with a response. He watched in total, absolute silence as the corrupt mayor finally gave up, spurring his horse wildly to catch up with the retreating deputies. The sound of the heavy, retreating hooves quickly faded, swallowed completely by the violently howling, ever strengthening blizzard. The clearing was empty once again, save for the rapidly filling tracks in the deep snow. The immediate, highly toxic threat of Oakhaven was gone, banished entirely by the sheer, unyielding presence of the silent protector. Callahan stood in the freezing storm for a long, quiet moment, letting the biting wind actively cool the raw, primal adrenaline pumping fiercely through his thick veins. The mountain was secure. His territory was entirely unbreached. He slowly turned his massive frame around, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the frozen wooden steps as he walked back toward the heavy, reinforced oak door. He reached out and pushed the heavy door open, stepping out of the violent, blinding white tempest and back into the deeply warm, wood-smoke-scented sanctuary of his home. He reached back and slid the heavy iron deadbolt securely into place with a loud, final, resounding click. He turned toward the center of the room, fully expecting to find Elara huddled beneath the heavy bear furs, completely trembling in the aftermath of her terrible panic. But she was not in the chair. Callahan froze, his piercing hazel eyes immediately locking onto the fragile, slender figure, standing quietly near the frosted front window. Elara stood there, in her faded powder blue dress, her dark hair falling softly around her pale, delicate face. She was not crying. She was not trembling. She was staring directly at him, her deep, sorrowful dark eyes holding an entirely new, deeply, profoundly complex emotion he had never seen before. The terrifying monster of the high timber had just driven away an entire armed posse without throwing a single punch, and now, trapped in the absolute isolation of the snowed-in cabin, he had to face the fragile woman who had witnessed every single second of his overwhelming, terrifying dominance. The heavy iron deadbolt slid into place with a profound, echoing finality that seemed to seal the entire outside world away forever. Callahan stood vekepete hot, his broad back pressed against the thick oak door, the frigid mountain air still clinging fiercely to his dark flannel shirt. Small clusters of white snow, resting on his massive shoulders, began to rapidly melt in the overwhelming heat of the cabin, tracing dark, damp paths down the heavily corded muscles of his chest. The violent, shrieking tempest outside was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, frustrated drumming against the seamless pine logs. Inside, the absolute silence was deafening. It was a thick, expectant quiet, punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic popping of the cedar logs burning fiercely in the massive riverstone hearth. Callahan took a slow, deep breath, intentionally forcing the wild, primal adrenaline of the confrontation out of his thick blood. He had just stared down a dozen armed men without raising a single fist, utilizing the pure, terrifying weight of his reputation to protect his territory. Now he faced a vastly more delicate, incredibly complex challenge. He slowly turned his towering frame away from the door, his piercing hazel eyes immediately seeking out the fragile woman he had just sworn to protect. Elara remained standing by the heavily frosted front window. She had not retreated to the darkest corner. She had not crawled beneath the heavy black bear furs to hide. This simple, profound act of remaining on her feet was a monumental victory for her shattered spirit. She stood illuminated by the golden, dancing light of the fire, her faded powder blue calico dress draping softly over her exceptionally slender, petite frame. The deep, agonizing terror that had previously clouded her beautiful dark eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a stunning, quiet clarity. She watched the giant mountain man with an intense, unwavering focus. In her brutal, unforgiving experience, whenever a man exerted physical dominance or won a dangerous confrontation, he immediately demanded praise, submission, or a heavy price from anyone weaker than him. She braced her fragile heart, waiting for the inevitable shift in his demeanor. She waited for him to boast, to swagger, to remind her of the massive debt she now owed him for saving her life. Callahan did absolutely nothing of the sort. He did not look at her with the arrogant expectation of a conqueror. He looked at Mofer with the exact same steady, profound, quiet respect he had shown her. Back at the dusty fairgrounds, he stepped away from the door, moving his colossal bulk across the woven wool rugs with a shocking silent grace. He walked directly past her, keeping a wide, deeply respectful distance, and headed straight for the heavy cast-iron stove occupying the far corner of the kitchen area. He picked up a thick iron poker and gently stirred the glowing embers, feeding a few small, dry pieces of kindling into the belly of the stove. His massive, calloused hands that could easily crush a man's skull or break a wild stallion, moved with a meticulous, gentle domesticity that entirely contradicted his terrifying exterior. Elara watched his broad back as he worked. The extreme visual contrast was mesmerizing. He was a colossus, an undeniable giant of the high timber, yet he was performing the simplest, most nurturing task imaginable. He poured a fresh measure of dark, rich bone broth into the heavy ceramic mug he had offered her earlier, setting it near the edge of the stove to warm. Then he turned and walked toward the large oak dining table. He pulled out one of the heavy, hand-carved wooden chairs, intentionally dragging its legs slightly across the floor to create a soft, non-threatening noise, ensuring he did not startle her. He sat down heavily, his massive frame dwarfing the sturdy furniture. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the polished wood, and simply looked at her. He offered no commands. He made no demands. He was deliberately surrendering the entire vast space of the cabin to her, giving her the absolute freedom to choose her next move. The storyteller in me needs you to understand the profound gravity of this silent gesture. For a woman who has been systematically stripped of her agency, whose entire existence has been dictated by the cruel whims of corrupt bankers and malicious gossips, the gift of unpressured space is vastly more valuable than gold. Callahan was wordlessly telling her that she was not a prisoner, she was not a burden, and she owed him absolutely nothing. Elara took a slow, fragile breath. The rich, savory aroma of the warming broth drifted across the room, causing her hollow, starved stomach to ache with a fierce, desperate intensity. The deep, radiating heat of the roaring fire slowly began to thaw the icy dread that had settled in her bones. She looked away from the giant cowboy, her dark eyes drifting slowly across the meticulously clean, heavily fortified room. Her gaze inevitably landed on the massive riverstone mantel. There, resting directly in the absolute center, bathed in the warmest, brightest light of the flames, sat her dented tin pie pan. She took a hesitant, trembling step forward. Her worn, paper-thin leather boots made no sound on the thick rugs. She took another step, then another, drawn toward the humble object with an irresistible, magnetic pull. She stopped directly in front of the hearth. The heat flushed her pale cheeks, bringing a soft, delicate pink hue back to her flawless skin. She reached out with wildly trembling, slender fingers and lightly touched the rim of the battered metal. It was deeply warm to the touch. A profound, staggering realization washed over her shattered heart. The men of Oakhaven had looked at this pan and seen only poverty, desperation, and an excuse to mock her. They had viewed her fragile state as an invitation to inflict pain. But the terrifying, legendary monster of the mountains had looked at Motf, this exact same object, and recognized the diamond-hard resilience it took to create something beautiful out of absolute nothingness. He had elevated her trauma. He had taken the symbol of her deepest humiliation and transformed it into a sacred relic of honor. You saved it. Her voice was barely more than a soft, fragile whisper, trembling like a solitary autumn leaf clinging to a frostbitten branch. It was the first time she had spoken without the crushing weight of pure panic choking her words. Callahan remained seated at the heavy oak table, his watchful hazel eyes never leaving her slender silhouette. Mort merely carried it. You are the one who filled it vekep, I had absolute perfection. His deep, rumbling voice washed over her, wrapping around her fragile spirit like a heavy, warm blanket. He did not offer empty flattery. He spoke with the unyielding, solid conviction of a man stating a fundamental law of nature. Elara closed her eyes, letting the profound truth of his words sink deeply into her wounded soul. For 6 agonizing months, she had actively believed the venomous lies the town had fed her. She had believed she was worthless, a forsaken burden, destined to fade away into the cold dust. But standing here, in the impenetrable safety of this mountain fortress, she realized that true strength did not look like the arrogant bluster of Mayor Higgins, or the cruel, petty gossip of the bankeress wife. True strength looked like the quiet, unwavering presence of the giant man sitting behind her, a man who possessed the terrifying power to destroy the world, yet actively chose to carefully protect a dented piece of tin. She turned away from the mantel, her dark eyes finding his across the dimly lit room. She did not run for the door. She did not seek out a dark corner to hide. Instead, she took a deep, steadying breath and walked slowly toward the cast iron stove. She reached out with delicate porcelain fingers and picked up the heavy ceramic mug of steaming broth. The heat radiated instantly through her freezing hands, anchoring her firmly to the present moment. She turned and walked toward the large oak table. She did not sit at the far end, placing a safe, defensive distance between them. She pulled out the chair directly adjacent to his and sat down. The physical contrast between them was breathtakingly stark. Callahan was a towering monument of rugged, weathered survival. His shoulders so impossibly broad, they seemed to block out the very walls of the cabin. His massive, heavily scarred hands rested on the table, thick with corded muscle and the undeniable evidence of a lifetime of brutal labor. Beside him, Elara looked like a fragile, exquisite porcelain doll. Her exceptionally petite, slender frame practically swallowed by the heavy, oversized chair. Her delicate, pale hands wrapped tightly around the ceramic mug, her knuckles small and bird-like, compared to the massive strength radiating from the man beside her. Yet, in this incredibly close proximity, there was absolutely no fear. The suffocating, toxic tension of the town was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound intimacy that felt heavier and more real than anything she had ever experienced. She brought the heavy mug to her pale lips and took a slow, careful sip. The rich, restorative warmth flooded her empty stomach, sending a desperate surge of vital energy spreading rapidly through her exhausted, freezing veins. She closed her eyes, letting out a soft, barely audible sigh of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the taste of survival. It was the taste of genuine, unconditional sanctuary. Callahan watched the subtle, beautiful shift in her delicate features. He watched the tense, rigid lines of pure terror slowly melt away from her perfectly sculpted jaw. He saw the color returning to her pale cheeks. A deep, fierce satisfaction settled heavily into his broad chest. He had spent his entire life building this impenetrable fortress, carving a life of absolute solitude out of the unforgiving high timber, believing he needed absolutely no one. He had actively shunned the chaotic, corrupt world of men, preferring the honest, brutal reality of the wild. But as he watched this incredibly fragile, deeply traumatized woman slowly sipping broth at his table, he realized that his massive home had always been entirely empty until this exact moment. The violent blizzard outside began to aggressively intensify, howling with a furious, shrieking vengeance. The heavy wind violently battered the seamless pine logs, piling massive drifts of pure white snow against the thick window panes, effectively sealing them completely off from the rest of the harsh world. The cabin groaned softly under the immense, crushing weight of the storm, but the thick walls held absolutely firm. The roaring river stone fire cast long, dancing, golden shadows across the heavy floorboards, enveloping the two contrasting figures in a cocoon of radiating, absolute warmth. They sat together in profound, unbroken silence for a long time. It was not the heavy, awkward, suffocating silence of strangers forced into proximity. It was the deep, shared, breathing silence of two deeply wounded souls who had suddenly, miraculously recognized the identical scars carved into each other. Hearts. Elara slowly finished the broth, the heavy ceramic mug finally resting empty on the polished oak wood. She did not immediately jump up to wash it. She did not frantically look for chores to perform to somehow earn her keep. She simply sat still, allowing her deeply exhausted, fragile body to actively accept the unprecedented luxury of total rest. She turned her delicate head, her dark, sorrowful eyes tracing the rugged, weathered profile of the giant cowboy. The firelight flickered across the heavy, faded silver scars cutting through his thick, dark beard. She saw the undeniable danger etched deeply into the hard lines of his face, the absolute lethal capacity that had so utterly terrified the armed posse. But she also saw the profound, quiet sadness hidden deep within his piercing hazel eyes. It was a specific, heavy kind of sorrow that only comes from years of total, unbroken isolation. She realized, with a sudden, staggering clarity, that the fearsome, legendary monster of the high timber was just as deeply lonely, just as fundamentally exiled from the world as she was. The corrupt town had cast her out because she was weak, destitute, and highly vulnerable. But they had cast him out because he was overwhelmingly strong, entirely uncompromising, and utterly impossible to control. They were two completely opposite sides of the exact same tragic coin, violently rejected by a society that only valued compliance and deceit. "Why did you cheer for me?" Her soft, fragile voice broke the heavy silence, floating gently across the small space separating them. The question was not born of panic or desperation. It was born of a deep, sudden, fierce need to truly understand the massive, complicated man who had just risked absolutely everything to pull her from the abyss. She watched his thick, rugged jaw clench slightly, the heavy muscles working beneath his beard. Callahan did not answer immediately. He slowly turned his massive head, his piercing hazel eyes locking intensely onto her delicate, waiting face. He looked at her with such raw, unfiltered honesty that it physically stole the breath from her lungs. He didn't offer a polite deflection. He didn't hide behind his stoic, intimidating armor. Because Mott know exactly what it costs to stand entirely alone in the dirt, while the whole world tries to convince you that you are absolutely nothing. The deep, rumbling tremor of his voice was thick with a heavy, unspoken agony that seemed to vibrate directly through the solid oak table. He slowly reached out his massive, heavily scarred hand, placing it incredibly gently on the table, just inches away from her small, pale fingers. He did not attempt to touch her, actively maintaining the deeply respectful boundary, but the profound vulnerability in the gesture was utterly overwhelming. "Mott built this fortress to keep the corruption and the cruelty out," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly intimate register. "Mott made myself into a monster because monsters do not get broken. But when Mott saw you standing at that table, holding onto that dented piece of tin, refusing to let those cowards steal the last tiny shred of your dignity, Mott realized that my thick walls haven't been keeping the cold out. They've just been keeping me entirely locked inside." Elara's heart seized, a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, profound emotion crashing violently through her fragile chest. The terrifying, absolute protector, the giant, who had just effortlessly banished a dozen armed men with nothing but a dark stare, was openly, willingly, bleeding his deepest, most heavily guarded insecurities right in front of her. He was just offering her a physical sanctuary from the deadly winter storm. He was actively, desperately offering her the key to his own heavily fortified, deeply isolated soul. She looked down at the massive, scarred hand resting on the polished wood. The rough, calloused skin told a brutal story of endless labor, of fighting wild beasts and enduring freezing winters entirely alone. Her own delicate, pale fingers trembled slightly. The trauma of the past 6 months actively screamed at her to pull away, to maintain her emotional distance, to never, ever risk trusting a man again. But the deep, diamond-hard resilience that had kept her alive, the pure, unyielding kindness that the town had failed to crush, surged forward with a sudden, breathtaking bravery. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Elara moved her small hand across the polished oak. She extended her delicate porcelain fingers, crossing the vast, terrifying divide between her fragile vulnerability and his massive, imposing strength. She gently, incredibly softly, laid her tiny hand directly over the heavy, scarred knuckles of the giant mountain man. Callahan's breath hitched violently in his broad chest, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed loudly in the quiet cabin. His massive muscles instantly went entirely rigid, utterly paralyzed by the sudden shocking heat of her soft, fragile touch. He stared down at their joined hands, entirely unable to comprehend the profound, impossible reality of the delicate, beautiful survivor actively choosing to reach out to him. The absolute, total trust radiating from her simple gesture was vastly more powerful, vastly more completely overwhelming than any physical blow he had ever endured. But just as the massive, heavy iron gates guarding his isolated heart finally began to violently groan and swing open, a sudden, sharp, violently unnatural sound cut directly through the roaring noise of the blizzard outside. It wasn't the howling wind. It wasn't the heavy snow burying the porch. It was the distinct, unmistakable, violently sharp crack of a heavy rifle shot echoing from the lower ridge, completely shattering the illusion that the danger had truly, finally passed. The sharp, violently unnatural crack of the heavy rifle shot echoed, like a physical blow against the side of the mountain, instantly shattering the profound, delicate intimacy that had just begun to bloom inside the quiet cabin. Before the terrifying sound could even fully register, in Elara exhausted mind, Callahan moved. He did not hesitate. He did not shout a command. With a terrifying, blinding speed that utterly defied his colossal, towering bulk, he lunged across the short distance separating them. His massive, heavily muscled arms swept completely around her fragile, exceptionally slender frame, violently dragging her entirely out of the oversized leather chair and pulling her instantly down to the solid oak floorboards. He twisted his massive body in mid-air, deliberately placing his immensely broad, thick back entirely between her delicate form and the heavy frosted windows. They hit the floor with a heavy, breathless thud, his colossal frame forming an absolute, impenetrable human shield over her trembling body. Elara squeezed her dark eyes shut, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, entirely bracing for the agonizing sound of shattering glass, or the chaotic splintering of the thick pine door. She waited for the brutal, bloody shootout that the unforgiving frontier always demanded. She waited for the absolute destruction of her fragile, newly found sanctuary. But the second shot never came. Instead, a vastly different, profoundly more terrifying sound began to build deep within the very bones of the towering mountain. It did not sound like men. It sounded like the earth itself was tearing open. It started as a low, incredibly deep, vibrating rumble that violently shook the meticulously polished floorboards beneath them. The heavy iron skillets hanging in the kitchen rattled aggressively. The roaring fire in the massive riverstone hearth flickered and danced wildly as the air pressure inside the heavily fortified cabin rapidly dropped. The deep, guttural vibration swiftly escalated into a deafening, thunderous roar that completely swallowed the shrieking wind outside. Callahan kept his massive body pressed heavily over Elara, his thick, scarred hand gently cradling the back of her head, completely protecting her from the overwhelming noise. He knew exactly what that monstrous sound was. He knew the treacherous, unstable geography of the lower mountain pass better than any living soul in the Wyoming territory. The cowardly, deeply frustrated posse from Oakhaven, entirely humiliated and stripped of their false authority, had fired a single, senseless warning shot into the blinding blizzard as they hastily retreated down the steep, dangerous trail. But in their blind, arrogant fury, they had failed to respect the wild, unforgiving nature of the high timber. The sharp, violent concussion of the heavy rifle, echoing against the sheer granite cliffs, had violently disrupted a massive, unstable cornice of heavy winter snow hanging precariously over the narrow canyon below. Nature had responded to their corruption with absolute, unyielding judgment. The deafening roar lasted for 2 agonizing, breathtaking minutes, as thousands of tons of compacted snow, heavy ice, and ancient pine trees violently cascaded down the steep gorge, completely wiping out the only accessible trail leading up to Callahan's isolated ridge. The avalanche violently buried the lower pass under 40 feet of impenetrable, freezing rock and snow. The cowardly men of the town were not crushed. They had already retreated just far enough down the valley to escape the deadly white wave. But as the thunderous rumbling finally began to fade, replaced once again by the steady, howling wind of the blizzard, the absolute reality of the situation settled heavily over the mountain. The trail was gone. The single, treacherous lifeline connecting Callahan's high mountain fortress to the cruel, toxic town of Oakhaven had been entirely, permanently severed by the violent forces of the earth. The massive avalanche had created an absolute, insurmountable physical barrier that absolutely no horse, no wagon, and no corrupt posse could possibly cross, until the deep spring thaw arrived many long, freezing months away. Callahan slowly lifted his massive head. He listened intently to the profound, heavy silence that followed the destructive slide. He felt the tension slowly draining from his heavily corded shoulders. The immediate threat was not just temporarily banished. It was entirely, fundamentally erased. He looked down at the incredibly fragile, beautiful woman trembling beneath him. Her dark eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, her pale hands fiercely gripping the heavy flannel of his shirt. The mountain just closed the door. His deep, rumbling voice was a soft, incredibly reassuring tremor in the quiet room. He slowly, agonizingly gently pushed himself up onto his knees, actively offering her the vast space she desperately needed to breathe. They fired a single shot in the canyon. They brought the entire lower ridge down. The trail is completely buried, Elara. Absolutely no one from that miserable town can reach this cabin until the spring flowers bloom. You are entirely, undeniably safe. Elara remained motionless on the thick wool rug. The profound, staggering weight of his words slowly filtered through her deeply traumatized, exhausted mind. The trail was gone. The town was gone. The cruel banker's wife, the corrupt mayor, the vicious whispers, the suffocating debts. All of it had been violently wiped away by the protective hand of the mountain. She stared up at the towering, legendary giant kneeling beside her. He had not drawn a weapon. He had not shed a single drop of blood. He had simply stood his ground, and the very earth itself had risen up to defend her. A sudden, overwhelming wave of pure, absolute relief violently crashed through her fragile chest. It was a feeling so intensely foreign, so deeply profound, that it completely stole her breath. She slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position, her slender, trembling hands resting on the heavy floorboards. She looked toward the massive, heavily reinforced oak door, and for the very first time in 6 agonizing, terrifying months, she did not vacate it as a flimsy barrier waiting to be broken by cruel men. She saw it as an absolute, impenetrable shield. Callahan stood up, his colossal frame easily dwarfing the surrounding furniture. He reached down, offering his massive, heavily calloused hand. Elara did not hesitate. She placed her delicate, porcelain fingers into his immense palm. He effortlessly, incredibly gently, pulled her lightweight frame up to her feet, steadying her trembling shoulders vacep. It had a deep, respectful grace. The brutal, unforgiving winter descended upon the high timber with a fierce, isolating vengeance. For the next 3 months, the massive log cabin remained completely entombed in deep, impenetrable drifts of pure white snow. The violent blizzards raged outside, howling against the seamless pine logs. But inside the heavy walls, a profoundly beautiful, deeply healing transformation began to unfold. Listen to me, friends, because the true healing of a shattered soul does not happen in a single, dramatic moment. It happens in the quiet, mundane, beautifully ordinary moments of profound safety. It happens in the deep, radiating heat of a massive riverstone hearth. It happens in the quiet, shared silence over a morning cup of strong, dark roasted coffee. In the beginning, Elara moved through the large cabin like a fragile, deeply frightened ghost. She was constantly braced for anger, constantly waiting for the towering giant to suddenly demand payment for her salvation. She would quietly mend his heavy canvas coats, scrub the heavy wooden floors, and meticulously clean the cast-iron stove, desperately trying to prove her worth, entirely driven by the deeply ingrained trauma of her past. But Callahan never demanded a single thing. He never raised his deep, rumbling voice. He never crowded her space. Instead, he actively, deliberately wrapped her in an aura of absolute, unyielding protection. When he went out into the freezing cold to tend to his massive draft horses in the heavily fortified barn, he always ensured the heavy iron wood box next to the hearth was entirely full, silently guaranteeing she would never feel the biting chill of the winter. When he sat at the large oak table in the evenings, meticulously cleaning his heavy leather riding tack, he would intentionally leave his massive, scarred hands resting openly on the polished wood, silently inviting her to bridge the distance whenever she felt ready. The extreme physical contrast between them became a source of deep, quiet comfort rather than intimidation. Elara began to realize that his immensely broad shoulders and terrifying, colossal strength were not weapons designed to crush her. They were the absolute, unshakable foundation of her new sanctuary. She watched him easily lift massive, heavy pine logs with a single hand, only to watch those exact same calloused hands carefully, meticulously carve a beautiful, delicate wooden comb for her dark hair from a piece of smooth cedar. But the true, profound turning point of her healing centered entirely around the mantle. Every single morning, Elara would wake in the deep, luxurious warmth of the heavy black bear furs, and her dark, sorrowful eyes would immediately seek out the massive river stone fireplace. There, resting exactly in the absolute center, perfectly illuminated by the dancing flames, sat her dented, blackened tin pie pan. Callahan had entirely refused to move it. He treated the battered, highly humble object with the reverence of a holy relic. He actively dusted it. He deeply protected it. One crisp, deeply freezing morning in late January, the heavy snow finally stopped falling. Brilliant, piercing winter sunlight flooded through the frosted window panes, casting warm golden rays across the thick wool rugs. Elara stood in the kitchen area, staring down at a large wooden bowl filled with precious, highly expensive white flour, rich churned butter, and a jar of sweet preserves Callahan had retrieved from his deep winter stores. She had not baked a single thing since the agonizing, humiliating day at the county fair. The mere thought of mixing the dough brought a heavy, suffocating wave of dark anxiety crashing against her chest. Baking had been her desperate, highly traumatic survival mechanism. It had been her final agonizing plea to a cruel world that had entirely rejected her. Callahan stepped quietly into the kitchen. He wore his heavy dark denim trousers and a thick woolen shirt, his massive frame radiating a deep, comforting heat. He did not ask her what she was doing. He did not pressure her. He simply walked over to the massive river stone hearth, reached his heavy, scarred hands up, and incredibly gently lifted the dented tin pie pan down from its sacred place of honor. He walked slowly back to the kitchen and placed the battered metal pan directly onto the wooden counter, right next to the bowl of flour. "You baked to survive them." His deep, rumbling voice was a soft, incredibly tender anchor in the quiet room. His piercing hazel eyes locked onto her hesitant, fearful face. He reached out and lightly, deeply respectfully touched the edge of the dented tin. "Now you bake entirely for yourself. You bake because it brings you joy. The survival is completely over, Elara. You are deeply, profoundly home." The words struck the very core of her fragile spirit, violently shattering the final, lingering remnants of her deeply ingrained trauma. She stared at the dented pan, the symbol of her profound poverty, her sheer desperation, and her absolute humiliation. But as she looked at it now, resting safely beneath the protective gaze of the legendary giant mountain man, it entirely ceased to be a symbol of pain. It became a profound testament to her own diamond-hard resilience. It was the vessel that had miraculously guided her out of the darkness and directly into the absolute safety of his massive arms. Elara took a slow, deep, trembling breath. She reached her delicate, pale hands directly into the wooden bowl. She baked. She did not bake a simple, desperate apple pie from scavenged scraps. She utilized the rich, heavy butter. She rolled the dough with a newfound, quiet confidence. She filled the dented tin pan with the sweet, highly fragrant preserves, crimping the edges with meticulous, loving care. And when the deep, warm, incredibly rich aroma of baking pastry finally filled the massive log cabin, completely overpowering the scent of the cedar wood smoke, the lingering ghost of the forsaken widow entirely vanished. In her place stood a remarkably beautiful, quietly radiant woman. The hollow, deeply sunken shadows entirely faded from her delicate cheeks, replaced by a soft, healthy flush. Her deep, sorrowful dark eyes completely lost their hunted, terrifying glaze, sparkling instead with a profound, peaceful clarity. She had actively reclaimed her own, deeply inherent worth, entirely supported by the unyielding, fierce protection of the towering man who completely refused to let the cruel world touch her. The deep winter slowly gave way to the gentle, highly persistent thaw of the early mountain spring. The massive, impenetrable drifts of snow surrounding the cabin began to finally melt, transforming into rushing, crystal-clear alpine streams. The heavy, violently howling winds softened into warm, deeply fragrant breezes, carrying the sharp scent of blooming wildflowers and fresh pine. One late afternoon, as the golden sun began to dip behind the jagged western peaks, casting long, deeply beautiful shadows across the valley, Elara stood out on the heavy wooden porch. She wore her faded powder blue calico dress, but she no longer wrapped the heavy gray shawl tightly around her thin shoulders. She stood tall, her petite, highly slender frame radiating a quiet, undeniable strength. She looked down the steep mountain pass. The trail was finally, completely clear. The massive avalanche debris had entirely melted away. The physical barrier separating them from the town of Oakhaven was completely gone. She was entirely free to leave. She possessed the means, the health, and the complete liberty to walk right back down that treacherous mountain and return to the world of men. The heavy, rhythmic thud of massive boots echoed on the wooden porch behind her. Callahan stepped out of the cabin, his towering, highly muscular frame immediately casting a deep, highly protective shadow over her. He came to a stop right beside her, leaning his thick, heavy forearms against the sturdy wooden railing. He looked down the cleared mountain pass, his rugged, heavily bearded jaw clenching slightly. He had deeply dreaded this exact day for months. He had actively watched her heal. He had entirely given her his deeply guarded heart, without uttering a single spoken demand, but he absolutely refused to trap her. He was a creature of the high, lonely timber, a legendary giant deeply feared by civilized society. He fundamentally believed he possessed absolutely no right to keep the beautiful, radiant woman anchored to his totally isolated existence. The road is open. His voice was a deep, rumbling whisper, thick with a heavy, deeply agonizing sorrow that entirely mirrored the violent pain he had felt the day he first saw her standing at the fairgrounds. He actively refused to look at her, terrified that his piercing hazel eyes would openly betray the desperate, shattering plea completely screaming in his soul. If you wish to return to the valley, Mort will safely escort you. Mort will ensure no man ever dares to speak a cruel word to you again. You are entirely free, Elara. Elara did not look down the mountain trail. She slowly turned her delicate head, her dark, profound eyes locking entirely onto his rugged, deeply weathered profile. She saw the immense, highly crushing vulnerability completely hiding beneath his massive, terrifying exterior. She saw the man who had actively made himself into a monster solely to survive, only to miraculously become the gentlest, most profoundly loving sanctuary she had ever known. She turned her petite body entirely toward him. She reached out with her small, delicate hands, and firmly, completely intentionally grasped the heavy, calloused fabric of his dark flannel shirt. Callahan instantly froze, his massive breath completely hitching in his broad chest. He slowly turned his head, his wide, intensely watchful eyes dropping down to meet her steady, entirely unwavering gaze. Why would Mort ever walk back down into the freezing dirt, she whispered, her voice ringing with a soft, entirely unshakable, diamond-hard absolute certainty, when Mort have already found the absolute highest, most beautiful summit in the entire world. She did not wait for his shocked, completely overwhelmed mind to entirely process the profound depth of her declaration. She stepped directly into his massive, intensely radiating space. She slid her delicate, slender arms completely around his incredibly thick, deeply corded waist, pressing her cheek firmly against the solid, highly protective wall of his massive chest. Callahan let out a ragged, deeply shattered gasp. The heavy, immense iron vault that had entirely guarded his lonely heart for his entire life, completely, violently blew entirely open. He swept his massive, totally powerful arms entirely around her slight, beautiful frame, lifting her effortlessly entirely off the wooden floorboards. He buried his rugged, heavily bearded face deeply into the soft, dark silk of her hair, holding her incredibly tightly, completely fiercely against his violently beating heart. He did not bellow his triumph to the empty valley. He did not roar. He simply held her with a profound, highly reverent, entirely consuming devotion, silently promising the very heavens that he would spend the rest of his natural life absolutely cherishing the deeply beautiful, completely resilient woman who had miraculously chosen to stay in his arms. And that, my friends, is the absolute truth of the frontier. True, profound strength does not reside in the heavy iron of a loaded rifle, nor does it live in the highly cruel, toxic whispers of a corrupt town. True strength lies entirely in the quiet, diamond-hard resilience to fiercely keep a deeply tender heart entirely alive in a violently harsh world. It lies in the profound, totally absolute courage to finally look past the terrifying, highly intimidating exterior of a mountain and actively choose to build a completely beautiful, utterly unshakable home entirely within its protective shadow. If this story brought a bit of warmth to your hearth tonight, please like the video and subscribe. It tells me you value these tales of profound healing, absolute justice, and the quiet, undeniable power of true, protective devotion. We have many more trails to ride together. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the help of AI tools and has been carefully edited. All rights reserved.